At this time, we will begin our final panel of the day, moderated by Dr. Gwyneth Sutherlin. Dr. Sutherlin is assistant professor here at CIC and a leading expert in social cultural analysis, which is the translation of quantitative research into discrete technology design for decision making. Also, she develops curriculum to advance the leadership for globally integrated operations in the information environment, and supports the Joint Staff as a subject matter expert. The theme of this panel is the pandemic and the information environment. Our participants are Amy Sitze, Senior Plans and Analysis at the Joint Military Information Support Operations Web Operations Center, Andrea Brennen, Vice President of Design and Visualization at In-Q-Tel, and Dr. David Perlman, Data Scientist at Leviathan Security Group. Dr. Sutherlin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here and to be moderating this panel. And after all of our distinguished speakers and moderators, my colleagues this morning, our job is really so easy to follow up, to synthesize many of their insights that we have heard throughout the conference today. So this panel, Information in the Pandemic, will explore the complicated role that information has played for decision-making throughout the COVID-19 crisis and pandemic. During our morning panel, and we're primarily going to be building on the insights that we heard from Dana Hall, Thomas Millar, and Mark Montgomery, who described the critical response in policy, security, data infrastructure decisions that they were involved with at DHS, HHS, and the Cyber Solarium Commission. Especially early on in the crisis, they were relying on a clear assessment of information about the pandemic, as well as understanding how the information environment itself was now part of the decision calculus about safety and risk. So in this panel, we will hear from individuals who collect, analyze, visualize, and operationalize information as part of the decision-making process. They must discern what information is real, where it is coming from, and where we might want to go next, to what extent we can even control any of these elements. What parts of our decision during the pandemic can we visualize? How can we visualize this information, and how does visualization help with decision-making? And finally, how does information go from the thing that feeds decisions to become the very thing that we are even planning and strategizing about? The very nature of information has really changed conceptually. So again, we have experts who deal with different dimensions of information that are all going to come together and talk about different aspects of information. And I would like each one of them to address where their expertise comes from in their introductory remarks, but then we're going to kind of bring it together in a discussion. So initially, we have Dr. David Perlman, who's had his doctorate at University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's worked in the private sector at places like Twitter and the Leviathan Security Group as a data scientist. He's presented on social media and influence campaigns at SOCOM SoftWorks, Black Hat Conference, Naval Postgraduate School, CDAN's Lawrence Livermore National Labs, and has been interviewed in publications including the Wall Street Journal. He's lead author on social media and influence campaigns, and been published in with a book series by Lawrence Livermore National Labs. He's been published in Cyber Defense Review and is currently working with a startup group. So he has extensive technical expertise and will be touching on that dimension. We have Miss Andrea Brennen, who is Vice President of Design at In-Q-Tel Labs. She heads the Human-Machine Interface team, which conducts applied research on user experience of AI, uncertainty visualization, and AI assurance. She also helps technology startups use visual design to communicate complex ideas in clear, intuitive ways. Previously, as a member of the research staff at MIT, Lincoln Laboratory, she's created software tools to support the exploration of visual analysis and communication of network data. She has a master's in architecture and architectural design from MIT and a bachelor's degree in mathematics and studio art from Grinnell College. And we've worked together on visualization of complex ideas such as influence across the information environment. Let me tell you, this one still has us quite stumped. It's very complex. And I have with me here in our fabulous CIC studio, Miss Amy Sitze. She is an Air Force civilian serving as a senior plans analysis for the Joint Military Information Support Operations Web Operations Center. There may be one too many words there. Joint Military Information Support Operations Web Operations Center. Do I get a treat for saying that?
Yes, you do.
Okay. At U.S. Support Operations, U.S. Special Operations Command. Previously, she served with Department of Army, at the as an Information Operations Planner at U.S. Africa Command, which is where I first got to know her when she was with the J39 at U.S. AFRICOM. She has 15 years of experience as an information operations professional. Ms. Sitze has tactical, operational, and strategic levels of information operations experience. So all the areas of expertise she'll be talking about operationalizing information. She has been able to incorporate technical capabilities, integrating all influence activities into planning operations. She's a graduate of Troy State University, a retired U.S. Army Masters of Space operator, and she's been awarded the St. Dominic Medal for her instrumental work in advancing Army space operations across the DoD by the Army Space Professionals Association. I'm so delighted to have this panel who all work on these different dimensions of information come together to help us understand how information was feeding into the decisions around policy connected to our earlier panel. So, Dr. Perlman, David, I'm going to start with you. Can you take time to tell us, based on your experience, often in the private sector, but I know you've worked with government and national labs, to tell us, and you're also coming to us from the West Coast, that's correct? Yes. Okay. So thank you for your time and dialing in with us today. David, so can you tell us a little bit about, from the technical side, the formulas and the algorithms in some of the major platforms that we're familiar with, how they're using the information? We've had more of a focus, in my opinion, on these technical platforms where we're getting our information during COVID, and I don't know if you feel people are beginning to understand them better, or we're just relying on them more and they're more in our consciousness because we talk about them more. Should we be relying on them? Can you tell us a little bit more about what we should know about how they work? Over to you.
Well, thanks. Thanks for the introduction. It's great to be here, Gwyneth. That is a great question. I think that, I think this is probably stating the obvious, but younger people are getting more familiar with how these things work. But I think for a lot of us who are, in planning and decision-making stages, there are a lot of misconceptions about what's going on with social networks, and in particular, how and why there are different forms of what some people call information disorder that play out on social networks. So I've always found it useful to start with just a little bit of an overview. People get really worried about things like, oh, why is so much medical or political disinformation spreading on Facebook and Twitter? Or maybe people get worried about, why is there so much censorship on Facebook and Twitter? And, depending on what you're more concerned about, people get caught up in an image of, sinister crowd of whoever sitting at these tech companies planning one sort of thing or another. And the reality is that neither of those things are true. The only thing that's going on is that the system, which is not just algorithms, but also the engineers that design the algorithms, the marketing people who tell the engineers what to focus on, and the executives, the lawyers, the government policy liaison people who tell them about you know, the issues of liability risk that they need to focus on. All of this, it's all a big machine, and it's all focused on trying to increase the amount of eyeball time that is focused on the platform and decrease the amount of legal and regulatory risk that the companies are subjected to. So these sort of the tension between these different factors really just gives rise to the behavior that we see here, rather than any sort of malicious behavior on the part of the platforms. Now, an argument could be made, which I might come back to later depending on time, that there's a sort of sin of neglect going on where there are problems that they really ought to know that they should be addressing. But anyway, as far as how the system goes, imagine that there's sort of a loop with two funnels pouring into each other. So one of the funnels is the servers, which are being controlled by the engineers and the algorithms. So content comes into the platform. And just to be clear, I'm talking about social media here. Obviously, the information landscape contains many, many different kinds of information, and I'm really I only am qualified really to talk about social networks. So the algorithms of the social network, information is coming in from the public. They're not creating their own content. It's the users are dumping things into this funnel, and then the servers and the engineers and the lawyers and so on decide what to show people. Then the other funnel is the collective eyeballs of everybody looking at their devices. And in that funnel, some things get lost, i.e. no one really spends much time looking at them, but other things get emphasized. You spend a lot of time, you click that video and you watch it to the end, you scroll up and then you stop scrolling because something caught your attention. So they know all these things. They know how fast you're scrolling. They know what you stop on. They know when you start a video playing, and they know when you stop it playing, and they know when you click on something, when you type something. So they're watching that, and then they just want more of that. They don't really care about anything other than wanting more interaction and more attention to the platform, at least for their own business reasons. So the information about everything that people do goes into a decision-making process, and it gets combined with information about potential legal risk and so on, and market risk, those sorts of things. So sometimes you'll have a situation where a platform will de-emphasize a certain kind of content, not because people aren't clicking on it, but because they're concerned that it might lead to regulatory or legal liability. Or let's see, what would I call this? I don't know what you would call boycott liability. Like, there's a sense that if a certain platform gets a reputation for being filled with a certain kind of content, they may do a calculus and say that on average, our users we're likely to lose more users than we'll gain if we get a reputation of being a certain kind of platform. Now, in an ideal world, what one might argue that in an ideal world, there would be a sort of a rich and thriving marketplace of different companies competing with each other. Personally, I believe this, but you can decide what you think yourselves. If there were many different companies, then there would be no problem with the situation I'm describing, because one company would go for one market niche and they would emphasize one kind of content. Another company would go for another market niche and they would emphasize a different kind of content, and everybody would be able to, to get what they wanted to without necessarily the whole thing being dominated by one consideration. But what you see right now is that you have, for roughly speaking, you have one big platform, and so there's sort of a general truth that, like, things that are extremely inflammatory, for example, they tend to catch people's attention. So things that are extremely inflammatory for any reason, regardless, get amplified. And what that means is that if you get angry every time you see COVID misinformation, that's attention. Like, your anger is attention. So even though you hate it, the system knows that it's getting to you, and so it makes more of that kind of information. So what I described there is what I think of as sort of phase one of information disorder. And if you watch the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, which I highly recommend, it's mostly driven by Tristan Harris is the person in that documentary, and you can also read a lot of stuff that he's written, but the documentary is great. And it goes into a lot of detail. It provides a very clear sort of introduction to this sort of what you might call unintentional information disorder, where the algorithms are just pumping things up because they set people off without really much concern for why or how or who wants that content or who's benefiting. And this is things like that, you know, this is responsible for things like, like concerns that people have, like, oh my God, the content is such low quality. People are watching stupid videos of a cat falling off a ledge, and that, what is our culture coming to? That's sort of this phase one of information disorder or unintentional information disorder. Now, the problem is that might be silly, but not necessarily dangerous. But a system that works like that with sort of no supervision, not only, well, another metaphor you can think of is if you imagine a sort of Lord of the Flies island where the children are running amok with no adult supervision, the children might do a bunch of silly and destructive things, but they don't really have a sinister agenda. They're just not very thoughtful. But the problem is that that's a situation that's ripe for someone to come in and manipulate it. So then we get what I think of as maybe phase two information disorder, which people only started thinking about more recently. And this is actually, incidentally, is reflected in that documentary. It only really comes up at the end. They start to mention that there's also malicious manipulation going on more recently. When you don't have any, like, an intelligent guiding hand at the tiller, there's a lot of room for people to come in and figure out how do you game different parts of that. So there are a few different mechanisms that you can game that system. So the most obvious way that you would think of to game the system is that you pay the platform to show more of what you want them to show. And actually there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, we would like to encourage that as much as possible, because that's the part that you have the most transparency about. So for instance, I actually thought it was bad news when Twitter announced that they weren't going to show political ads anymore, because that means that anyone who wants to promote political content has to do it through nefarious means if they want that to happen on Twitter. They don't even have the option of doing it in a way that's transparent and accountable. For example, you know, after the, regardless, again, I don't want to weigh in on the merits of one thing or another, but there was a lot of talk after the 2016 election of Russian ads that were paid for by Russian sources on Facebook. And the important thing is that actually we knew that that happened. It was possible to see that that happened. And in the end, that kind of became a one-time thing because it happened once, we saw it, and we did something about it. So now they don't accept political ads from offshore sources anymore, which is an improvement in the system. But on the other hand, all across the entire information landscape, you can have people using the dark web to buy networks of bots and things like that to pump up content through other mechanisms, such as, you remember how I said a minute ago that the algorithms are watching what you click on, they're watching how fast you scroll, they're watching many indicators to get a sense of your emotional engagement with the content. So botnets, what we're talking about there is a whole bunch of fake accounts that pretend to have an emotional engagement with the content. So then the algorithm suddenly thinks, oh, people really like this. And then the algorithm shows more of it because it's doing what it's supposed to do. So it's not really showing more of that content because the engineers wanted it to, or because the lawyers or the policy people wanted it to. It's just that somebody tricked the system. Now, this is actually not good for the companies because the companies want to have control over their platforms. They don't want other people to manipulate their platforms because other people aren't whatever else someone might do to manipulate Facebook or Twitter, that other person's goal isn't to maximize Twitter's profits. So Twitter really doesn't want this to happen. So I actually think that I wish we could all just get along. Let's put it that way. I wish there would be more of a conversation between the tech platforms and all the other people, governments and so on, who are trying to solve this problem, because on some level there really is an alignment of interests. And it remains a mystery to me why there isn't more crosstalk between the communities, which is why I'm here today. I'm going to leave it at that for now so we can move on, but maybe there'll be more at the question session.
Thank you. There's so many elements there that I want to dive into more deeply. I took a bunch of notes, but thank you for those opening comments. I think that was a great way to get us started with the technical side of it. And now we're going to segue into something that bridges the technical, but then starts going into how we make use of the technical. So Andrea, you work across these two things with technology and machines, with the human-machine interface. And so this is a really challenging area. You often work, I know you worked with like the CDC and visualizing the flu in the past. I remember you talking about that, but now we've got this whole new thing. You visualize in particular uncertainty. And I mean, uncertainty is something that I would absolutely associate with the pandemic in so many different ways. It's been hard to know what we know, partly because we were just learning it, and also because of what David was just describing. There's manipulation around it, and it's hard to know what information is real when we are not always in control of these things. So can you describe a little bit of your work around uncertainty, what it means to visualize something in this type of topic, and how that connects to decision making, and just, you know, give us some examples. I think this is so fascinating.
Sure, thanks for the introduction. First of all, just want to make sure that you can hear me okay. Okay, great. Right, so as you mentioned, I run the human-machine interface team at In-Q-Tel Labs, which focuses on the user experience of AI and AI tools. And I basically spent my whole career kind of working at this intersection of the technical and aesthetic. So trying to figure out how we can design and also evaluate visual interfaces that help people understand quantitative information. And really the reason that we're doing this at In-Q-Tel is because we're trying to figure out how we can help people who aren't data scientists or engineers understand and use the output of these AI and ML models more effectively. So I think in general, there's a lot of people in the role of users of these tools who are domain experts. So they may know a lot about a particular subject matter, but they maybe don't have a substantial background in machine learning or statistics. And so we're trying to figure out how we can design interfaces that help make up some of that knowledge gap. And yeah, since this is a panel about information in the pandemic, I thought I'd talk about the work that you mentioned that we've done on infectious disease forecasting. But before I get into the specifics of that, I want to just try to convince everybody why it's important to even think about something as esoteric as how to visualize uncertainty. And Gwyneth, as you know, this is a topic I'm very passionate about, so please let me know if I'm rambling on a bit too much. Okay, so just a little background first of all. As I'm sure everyone knows, the output of machine learning models is imperfect and incomplete. So models don't generate facts, they make predictions based on statistical analyses of data that's been collected previously. These predictions are probabilistic, which means they're always uncertain. And then to make matters worse, every single step in the process of collecting, analyzing, and interpreting data and then making predictions introduces the potential for other types of uncertainty, assumptions that aren't disclosed, there's error of all different types, and we also have to worry about bias of all different types. But somehow, even though we all know this, it can be surprisingly easy to forget about this uncertainty in practice. And I think this is partly because too often the tools that we use kind of obscure important assumptions about the data that we're looking at. Sometimes they downplay uncertainty, or they downplay the ambiguity, or they just convey uncertainty in ways that are confusing or unhelpful, particularly to people who don't have a lot of advanced training in statistics. And I think this is a real problem because if you don't understand the uncertainty in the data that you're looking at, it's basically impossible to assess the reliability of the information that you're trying to base your decisions on. So way back in 2017, we got the bright idea that data visualization might be able to help us with this challenge. It hasn't turned out to be quite as helpful as we initially hoped, but I'll get to that. But we were optimistic several years ago. We thought, well, data visualizations can summarize a lot of information. They can help people see patterns and understand trends. But we thought the problem was with our capabilities. So a lot of visualization and analysis tools, they don't provide a lot of different capabilities for displaying uncertainty. So you've probably all seen error bars added to charts, and that's great and very useful. But if you're looking at a type of data, like a different type of data, say, the location of something or the timing of events or what category something is predicted to belong to, it's not so obvious how to represent that kind of uncertainty visually. How do you even show error bars on a map? We just don't have a lot of standardized conventions for displaying these things. And as a result, for people like myself who make a lot of data visualizations, I don't want to admit this, but sometimes it's just tempting to leave out the uncertain information because you don't have a good way of representing it. And this is a problem, it turns out, because there's this pretty common cognitive bias that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky write about. They call it what you see is all there is. So this is basically a tendency that not all of us, but many of us are subject to overlook or discount information that isn't right in front of us. And in our work, we design a lot of visualization prototypes, but we also run controlled experiments to evaluate how people respond to data and information when it's shown to them in different ways. And we've confirmed the existence of this what you see is all there is bias in a number of our studies. So one thing that we've seen over and over again is that when we show people a data visualization that doesn't explicitly show uncertainty, most people tend to treat the data as if it's certain. And ironically, this happens even when we tell people that the data isn't certain. But somehow it's almost as if what we're looking at or the data that we see carries more rhetorical weight than what we're told about it as a caveat. And this is a problem in practice, especially if we don't have robust tools for representing uncertainty, because we know that when we're looking at visualizations as kind of evidence that we're basing a decision on, if we're not showing the uncertainty, then we can inadvertently misrepresent what we think about the world by implying that we know more than we do. So this is, in general, not a great practice. Okay, so everything that I've said so far is pretty abstract, so let me try to give you an example. Back in 2017, way before the current pandemic, my colleague George Siniowski and I started collaborating with Dylan George, who used to work at In-Q-Tel, but is now actually the director of operations for the new Center for Epidemic Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics. And we decided to look into how infectious disease forecasts are visually represented and how the uncertainty in these forecasts is communicated to decision makers. And for this project, we were very fortunate in that we were able to collaborate with folks over at the CDC who run a program called FluSight. And this is kind of a centralized effort to set common targets for crowdsourced seasonal influenza forecasting models. Now, what we set out to do was build a new tool called VisiFlu, which would bring together multiple forecasts to help analysts at the CDC kind of compare uncertainty across those different forecasts and hopefully be better able to anticipate when seasonal flu was likely to peak in a given year. So we were very proud of the work that we did. We developed this nice, simple interface after a lot of user research and a lot of design work. We were able to show a lot of different models in the same view. And we open sourced our first version of this way back in 2018. Our collaborators over at the CDC were very excited because they finally had a way to look at all these different forecasts together. And we were very excited to share this work more broadly. But when we did, we didn't quite get the reaction that we were hoping for. So again and again, we would demo our tool, all of us tech folks very excited about a new tool. And almost immediately, people would just question the usefulness of what we were doing and also of the forecast in general. So they would look at our display and they would just say, why is there so much uncertainty in these forecasts? Why are the models' confidence levels so low? They would basically say that our tool, VisiFlu, wasn't useful because the data we were showing wasn't actionable because there was so much uncertainty in the data. And they weren't wrong. Our tool wasn't, the data itself wasn't that actionable because there was so much uncertainty in it. But in my mind, this was a huge win, right? Because what our tool was doing was kind of prompting these questions about how much should we really trust these forecasts? How much can we really trust this information? And so we tried to explain to people again and again, all of this uncertainty was already in the data. You just didn't understand it before. And so VisiFlu is just the messenger. Like, don't hold, like, you just have like a clear understanding of the data that you're looking at. But this was a pretty tough argument to make. Anyway, we weren't deterred. We decided to take this a step further. And in 2019, we designed and ran a user study to look at how people resolved the ambiguity in VisiFlu. So we were really interested in this question of, like, when somebody sees multiple competing forecasts or predictions, what do they do with that? How do they make sense of that? And if you want an example, imagine you check the weather this morning on 2 different apps when you got up. And if one app told you that it was going to be 50 and sunny and clear, but the other app said that there was a 70% chance of rain, it's not obvious how to reconcile these different predictions. People have a lot of different heuristics for doing this. So some person may take a mental average. Another person might pay attention to the worst case scenario just to be on the safe side. Someone else might listen to the forecast that most closely aligns with what they want to hear. Anyway, we didn't really know what people would do with VisiFlu when forecast didn't agree, so we ran a study to try to collect data about how people would react. So we recruited participants on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, as we do with most of our studies. We randomly assigned them to different groups, and then we showed them versions of VisiFlu that had different numbers of forecasts shown. And then we asked all the participants to respond to this survey that had a bunch of questions, asking them to perform different tasks. So sometimes they had to retrieve information from the display. We asked them to make some judgments about the information. We asked them to also report on how much they liked the tool, how easy it was to use, things like that. And our findings were about as encouraging as that initial feedback we got from our VisiFlu demos. So we found that when people saw only one forecast, they had a high confidence in the information that really wasn't justified, given that it was an uncertain prediction. We saw that when people saw multiple conflicting forecasts, so when they saw information with a lot more ambiguity, they reported that they didn't like our tool, and they also performed much worse on the tasks that we gave them. And this was discouraging because we saw that occur even when the tasks had nothing to do with the uncertain information. And then third, they reported more confusion and frustration and more difficulty completing those tasks. So, these are clearly not the positive, optimistic results we were hoping for. And we started to think, maybe what was going on here is that the uncertainty, though accurate, was overwhelming participants somehow by adding a lot of additional complexity to the way that we showed the information. But we also felt that we were kind of faced with this tricky design dilemma, because on one hand, if we didn't include that additional nuance, we would encourage overconfidence. But when we did include the additional nuance that made the data represented in a more accurate way, we had all these other negative consequences. So again, not a super optimistic set of findings. Nonetheless, I want to say that the epidemiological community was always very receptive of this work. And we presented VisiFlu and the findings from our user study at Epidemic 7, which is a pretty big conference in the epidemiological world, in December of 2019. And this was like a really funny presentation for us because we had some like really good enthusiasm from a small group of folks, but most of the other people that we showed this work to in the tech world, they would react as if we were just taking on this like very weird esoteric problem. So, we would present this work, and I can't tell you how many times my colleagues in the tech world would be like, why are you spending so much time looking at flu? Like, who cares about disease forecasting? And like, why is uncertainty so important? So you guys all remember 2019. Anyway, so needless to say, we don't really get those questions anymore. And because of this work, in early 2020, we found ourselves frantically working with the CDC and the COVID-19 Forecast Hub on this thorny question of how should the CDC represent crowdsourced COVID-19 forecasts on their website to the public? And this was like one of the most interesting situations I feel like I've been in my career, because we had just done all of this work experimenting with all of these different potential solutions, and I wanted so badly to have a simple answer and be able to make a clear recommendation for like, this is the right way to do this. But of course, I think if I've learned anything from this work, it's that there aren't really simple answers. I am proud, however, that we were able to make several recommendations, which the CDC ended up following, about how important it was to supplement forecast data with a lot of contextual information and narratives about the underlying models. So we felt it was very important to display multiple models, not just one. And then we felt it was very important to disclose what each model assumed in terms of social distancing and contact reduction patterns, because the way that these assumptions are built into the model has, makes a lot of difference in what the predictions actually are. So our team actually did some of the early work to collect these assumptions in a standardized metadata format and make this information or these assumptions more easily accessible, not only to the CDC, but also to data journalists and to a lot of other people who were looking at these early forecasts. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't really know what to say in closing, but I guess the thing that I think I've taken away from this work is that a lot of the automated tools that we have access to today, they promise to offload the work of analysis to models and machines. And, we're constantly told that AI is going to draw out all these key insights for us and help us or enable us to make quick data-driven decisions in scenarios where those decisions wouldn't otherwise be possible. And I don't want you to take what I'm saying as downplaying the importance or the power of these tools. They're extremely powerful. But, as great as they sound sometimes, we just always have to stay critical and continue to question the assumptions that are built into these tools. We need to make sure that we're not building efficient tools that just make it easy for us to jump to the wrong conclusions. So, yeah, with that, Gwyneth, back over to you.
Thank you. Wow. I mean, just from David's remarks to yours, I feel like I've put so much together and I've really learned so much on how things can go wrong. But I also, from my own areas of expertise, I'm starting to think about how we can even operationalize some of the stuff you're talking about, not just to educate the public in a positive way. And your work sounds so important. I mean, just the timing of what you were already working on to be able to start to give some really evidence-based recommendations, having just done that experimental work is fascinating, and I'm so glad you're able to share that with us. But I'm going to transition now to someone who works in a very different world, and I can't help but already start to take what you're saying and put it in a very different context. So Ms. Amy Sitze, you work at SOCOM.
At SOCOM.
But with the Joint NISO Web Operations Center?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I don't think everybody knows what that is. If you want to give a brief overview of what that is, I really am more interested in your role there because you operationalize information, which is completely different. We've learned about how information technically kind of is spreading around and how it might be used, then how we get it out of the information environment to think about how to inform decisions, how we can use it, visualize it to inform decisions, but you take it to the next level and operationalize it. So can you tell us a little bit of, about where you work and what your role is?
Sure. So yes, I work at the Joint Military Information Support Operations Web Operations Center. So it's a mouthful. So for short, we call it the GEMWIC, and the operations for which we do is web ops. What does that really mean? That means that we at the GEMWIC are looking and using the internet to influence populations. And it's a unique role. It is still a role that is being learned and tested out, if you will, with what works, what doesn't work. It's been around for a while, but the center for which I now work in is still fairly new. In fact, we are not even fully operational capable, and we're still a few years out from that. But it does play into this conversation in the sense that we're using social media as a means for which understanding what was out there, the information that was out there being talked about through social media platforms. We were then taking that information and saying, how does this actually apply to military operations? And then we had to go one step further and say, okay, what do we need to do with this information in order to plan influence operations that will, by default, help support the U.S. interest at hand? So with that, there's a couple things to keep in mind. I mean, we talk about the algorithms, we talk about the visualization, And we at the GEMWIC also work with that, but we don't have all of that capability readily at hand. So, and again, we're working under DoD, so we have a very specific mission in supporting those DoD objectives. One of the things that we do like to take into consideration, or absolutely need to take into consideration before we start any planning effort, is what is being said that is out there. Then we need to understand who it's being said to. The third thing we need to understand is what is, when the information is said, what is the intent behind the information? And who is that information really intended for? And let me give you an example of this. So Gwyneth mentioned that I came from AFRICOM prior to moving on to SOCOM. And one of the things that we recognized in the information environment is that our adversary would say something and it would go through social media. It would get on the internet. It would then be populated via various means, whether it was the algorithms, whether it was just people retweeting, whatever the case may be. And I would then find myself sitting in meetings answering to colonels and general officers saying, hey, we need to do something about this information. And then I was at that position where I had to go and say, well, sir, that may not be in our best interest, because now we're taking information that maybe we haven't authenticated yet and we're making it credible, which you don't want to do. The other thing is that what I also was realizing is that information wasn't really directed to some of the audiences that was receiving it, because they'd read it and then, you know, they may go on to the next thing. Who was really concerned about the information was our military leaders, and our military leaders were concerned. So it dawned on me, as the more I involved or got involved in these operations, is that the intent of the author, if you will, of that information and the means for which they sent it was really directed towards the US to infiltrate decision making. And whether that was spending resources on something that they think they saw that was just really more a distraction, whether it was to get them to react and see how they responded to the information that was in the environment, or other means like that. So those are all things that we have to take into account when we are taking information that we see, whether it be social media, whether it be the media, news reporting, or even conversations with key leaders that we are interact with internationally, internally, or in a specific environment where we're working. And then figure out how to take that information, figure out what's real, and then understand how that information has been turned either against U.S. interests or for U.S. interests, and then figure out the third part in the planning effort is being able to then take that information and push it out through various information-related capabilities, depending on the effects that you want to achieve, in order to achieve effects that do directly support U.S. interests and U.S. objectives. So that's kind of the baseline of what we do and what I've done over the course of the last decade plus. What we saw, though, from the pandemic, kind of bringing it back to the initial conversation, is that there was so much going on and such a short time frame, because most of this was online, that people didn't know. And when I say people, I'm talking DoD. There was conversations in the media. You saw, you know, CDC and other entities getting on the news, reporting and whatnot. So it was very difficult to figure out and keep up with the information and understand what was the correct information and what was the information that was just kind of filtered in, but more with the intent, with a malicious intent, meaning disinformation. And that's something that in my role, we have to truly understand, look for, and plan accordingly. And we work with, you know, other information related capabilities. So I work on the social media side, but there's other entities where all of that information going through the environment by whatever means has to be integrated in order to come across for the US, for the benefit of the US, as a common narrative. And that's how we're operationalizing that information, is we're taking it and we're providing a narrative that all of the US entities can agree with, and in their own individual way, we're taking that narrative and then using that narrative to achieve the effects in the best of US interest. So that's a lot to take in. Some of the things that I wrote down as notes as I'm going back and kind of looking at it is, you know, we do see that words matter. So people will put words out there. People will interpret those words. So is it the right word? Is it the wrong word? Does it have different meaning or different context to different cultures, to different entities, which we find to be true. Same with US, you know, US citizens. We have the freedom of free speech and television and media and whatnot. And, you know, something I always tell my mom when she asks me about information, as I said, well, take one story, take the other version of that story, and somewhere in the middle is really probably the reality or the truth. But that's hard because people take a side based off of what they feel or what the message that best falls within their own ethics or values. So these are all things that play in the information environment when we're using it to try to, no kidding, operationalize it to meet US objectives, specifically within the DoD. Some of the things that we are responsible for, and when I say we, the US and my current position, is the information that we do put out, the information that we are sharing with various audiences. We do want to make it as credible as possible, because if it's credible and if it's authentic, then it's less likely to be countered. The other thing that has to be taken into account with our planning operations in order to operationalize the information is actually to ensure that what is being said and what people are hearing through the various means of which they receive information is also what they see on the ground. Actions have to match words, words have to match actions. If they don't, then there's a disconnect there, and that just makes it that much more challenging. We saw a lot of that during the pandemic with, you know, who was doing what in various countries, who had the best vaccination, who was the first to respond in some of these third world countries, all things that we had to take into consideration. I know we've been talking a lot about the infrastructure, the cyber piece throughout the morning, throughout the day. But one of the things that the pandemic also really showed us was the significance of information in the environment and how it's influencing decision making. And as we're moving towards strategic competition, what does that mean as we move along towards that strategic competition and away from what most of us have known for the last 20 years against VEOs? So these are all things that have to be considered, take a lot of understanding, whether it be the technology used, the algorithms, the fact of what are the bots doing, what is the paid advertising doing, and then you know, also trying to visualize, at least in my current office, of how does that information look? Where are the trends? What are the predictability of what's going to happen in the future in regards to this problem set? And that's a challenge that everybody has. It's definitely something that we haven't solved or been able to crack the nut on either. The biggest thing, though, from a DoD standpoint, is to understand that information is being used by all adversaries, us. It is a major aspect of what goes into decision making on both parts. It is a means for which we inform, we influence, but then also what do we want to convey, or what behaviors do we want to change through a message, through a narrative. We have technical means by which to get that information out there. We have less known technical means. You know, face-to-face interactions is just another example of how information can be in support of DoD objectives, and then understanding that infrastructure, but also understanding then, based off what we know that's happening online in the environment that gets circled around, is also a significant player in the decision making. What is it that is happening that is changing the minds or the direction of decisions, whether it be on our part or on the adversary's part? I know that's a lot of information in a very short amount of time. I may have been a little all over the place because there's a lot to consider, but I hope that at least gives you an example or an idea of how DoD is now using information that we see both through social media, through visualization, that is circulated by various means, and trying to operationalize it to directly support U.S. interests and DoD objectives.
Thank you so much. There's just a wealth of information, and this was a great conversation. So before I open it up to audience questions here, I wanted to give an opportunity for my panelists to have a discussion across some of your various topics. David, I know you had some additional comments that you wanted to return back to, but I first had a question for Andrea. You mentioned that you'd experimented with a couple different ways to visualize things, and I'm thinking about what David had, what each one of you had talked about, and in my mind, I'm considering this more as an idea of trusting information. David had talked about, the idea of transparency. When different companies were responding to regulations. For instance, you talked about no longer taking paid political ads. So now we're losing a way to track who's paying for things and transparency. And so now how do we trust where information is coming from? Or uncertainty, we need to be able to trust what we see in order to make decisions. And uncertainty or where the data, the level of variability across the data helps us make those decisions. And you talked about the users getting frustrated and not being able to even do other unrelated tasks. I think that's fascinating. Certainly where I am in CIC, and our students are looking at strategy and being strategic decision makers, you have to be able to trust the information to a certain extent in order to plan and make decisions. So to me, I'm translating all of this and synthesizing it as trust. And how would you kind of visualize that? I mean, is it a color? Is it a number? Is it what would you advise us to kind of do in these different areas? What does that look like for all of these different things? What did you arrive at? What does the interface look like? I didn't quite hear that. I know you said there should be narratives and everything, but was there something besides words that helps us with this? What are the visual cues?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. So I guess one way of answering your question is to say that, yes, we have experimented with a lot of different strategies for kind of conveying both confidence levels and probabilistic information that accompanies a prediction that comes out of a model. I'm going to come back to trust in a minute, but I've just going to talk about what I do know first. Trust is very, very difficult, I think. So we've had a lot of failed experiments in the way of trust, but yeah, we have experimented with some different visual ways of kind of displaying information about confidence. but I think there's a couple different ways to think about this, or a couple different important aspects to this question. So one is like, what's the actual visual representation that you use? And I think the most concrete advice I can give there is that we have found the best results when we use a different kind of visual dimension to convey this information about reliability or confidence. And what I mean by that is like, it depends a little bit on the type of chart or the type of visualization that you're using to convey your actual results or your actual kind of predicted outcomes. But say you're using, well, like in VisiFlu, we were using a timeline to show predictions about the timing of peak week. So we had, a horizontal timeline representing the duration of the flu season. And we were using like a opacity, so the how dark a color was to kind of represent the timing. And then we used a different visual channel or like a different visual dimension. In our case, it was color to represent confidence. So I think it's nice to just make that distinction. You don't want to reuse the same visual dimensions to mean two different types of information. That is very confusing to people. We've experimented with a lot of different scales. So we've experimented with like just kind of a stoplight chart, trusted, not trusted, or unknown. We've used kind of a quantitative scale from like 1 to 8, I think, and translated that into a color scale. And then when it comes to probability values, which can be an analog for like the confidence assessment that comes out of a model, for that you get a numeric value that you can also translate into some other visual marking. And the most success we found there is not to display like a full range from 1 to 100, but instead to bucket that into a couple different categories. So in VisiFlu, I think we had 6 buckets from like light yellow to light red. And I think that's a helpful reminder because it's important to keep in mind how people are going to use the information and like what level is a meaningful unit for your users. So in the case of VisiFlu, if one model was predicting that flu was going to peak in a particular week with 68% confidence, there's really no meaningful difference between a confidence level of 68 versus 67. It's like not very actionable. So we kind of converted our 100-point confidence scale into, like I said, I think 6 categories. So those are some strategies that we've found successful. However, when it comes to trust, we have experimented with a lot of different ways of trying to measure how trustworthy people find information. And I don't think we really have any findings other than this seems to vary a lot by use case, and it seems to vary a lot depending on the individual. So, people bring a lot of their own previous experiences and assumptions to any data that they're looking at. And it's very hard to separate that from someone's assessment of whether the information itself is trustworthy. So yeah, I think it's very difficult to kind of put that pressure on a tool, I guess, to like help someone to trust the information. I think that's a little bit too ambitious of an expectation for our analytic tools. That's a bit of a dump. That's the best I can do.
That sounds like a job for an interdisciplinary team where multiple people have the information. Okay, so I would like to go back to David. I know you had some additional comments, but one thing that stuck out to me was you seemed to be inferring that there needed to be someone, that there was no one in charge exactly, and there needed to be someone in charge. Were you saying that there should be, and who would that be? You don't have to answer that, but that was something that seemed to be underlying some of your comments. But you did say that you had some additional comments of time allowed, so I'll yield to you if you wanted to expand on your earlier comments.
Well, I gotta say I'm impressed that you zeroed right in on what is kind of the big question about all the social media stuff, at least. Who should decide what's on the platform and what's not on the platform? And I'm also going to dodge a little bit, but I'll try not to dodge all the way. I think from my point of view, the best thing to do is to have a thriving and diverse ecosystem of different companies so that, in some sense, you can let the market decide. It's sort of it's kind of a liberal democracy sort of point of view of things. If you have a bunch of different platforms, then Well, okay, so let me say, so the principle is not a sort of abstract libertarianism. The principle is that the problem we have is that if there's one platform that everybody is looking at and somebody figures out how to game that system, then whoever figured out how to game that system has suddenly gained an enormous amount of power because now they have control over what shows up on everybody's screen. But if you have 100 different companies, and some people are really into, Pinterest because Pinterest is where people who are into needlepoint like to go. And somebody's really into, I don't know, Tumblr, because Tumblr is where people who are really into like little art and poems like to go, and so on and so forth. If everybody is kind of not all living in one big world, if somebody figures out how to game the needlepoint algorithm on Pinterest, that doesn't, to put it bluntly, that doesn't really overthrow democracy. At best, anybody who games power over one of these individual platforms is only influencing a small section of the population. So I think it's a security through diversification, which is that's the attitude that I take about this. I don't really take the attitude of things should be locked down and controlled for security, although it is worth noting that it would probably be pretty hard for us to run a massively effective influence operation against the Chinese population because the government retains strict control over their social media. So that may actually be an effective social media security strategy, but it's not one that I'm personally in favor of. I think that's an important distinction to make. There are a lot of things that are effective security strategies that may not be the things you actually want to try to do. So, yeah. So, but the reason that that's a dodge is because then you have to ask, well, whose responsibility is it to make sure that there is a rich and thriving ecosystem of competing platforms? And at that point, there isn't really any answer except, broadly speaking, antitrust sort of answers. And this is the kind of answer that does not make you popular at a social media company, saying that the social media company itself should be broken up. Definitely not what anyone wants to hear. But it's hard for me to see how there can be a healthy and thriving ecosystem when the platforms are so consolidated. And I actually think that you can spread this to a broader sense of it's complicated. Yeah, it's complicated because there was an earlier day when everyone got their information from 3 major news networks, and you didn't see a lot of propagation of active disinformation campaigns in that environment. But there were a different sort of disadvantages to having such consolidated control over the information environment. And then later you had a breakdown where it fragmented into hundreds of channels of cable TV news. And you actually did start to see a rise of, deceptive and disinformation type situations when that happened, long before the internet became a situation. So I don't want to make it sound like there's one easy answer that's going to solve everything, fragmentation versus consolidation. But I do think that many of the problems with social media that we are looking at right now would only really be addressed by having a more diverse ecosystem of social media sources. And of course, once we solve those problems, then there'll be another round of problems that we'll have to think about. So just as a side note, one thing that I find pretty amusing is that some of the biggest companies have what you might call AI ethics groups. Some of you might have heard about a woman named Timnit Gebru who was fired from Google some months ago, and it was controversial among the tech world. And people turned it into a big question about there were a lot of identity-related questions that came up around that in the popular discussions and stuff like that. But what I thought was really going on there is that they published a paper that would have required Google to take responsibility for the content rather than just saying, well, it's just an algorithm. There's nothing we can do about it. These algorithms are so complicated. We're struggling to try to get it under control, but everyone agrees that these algorithms are beyond our control. And yes, I get that that's a problem, but at least it means it's not our fault. Like that's sort of that's kind of the party line. And when you see these congressional hearings, the representatives of these companies are like, well, we're doing everything we can. These are very difficult problems. And to some extent that's true, but that's also dodge for them. Like they are dodging responsibility a bit because they can decide a lot of things. I mean, they may not have figured out all the details of how machine learning algorithms work, but they could do more of something or less of something. And there's some things that they do a pretty good job of. There's child abuse, sex material is pretty well eliminated from the major platforms. And at some point when a lot of controversy came up about 6 to 8 years ago, somewhere in that range, about ISIS propaganda, they were showing, there was a very embarrassing instance where YouTube noticed, somebody pointed out to YouTube that they were running Volvo ads as mid-roll ads in the middle of ISIS propaganda videos, and that didn't make Volvo happy. And you know what? They figured out how to not do that. They were in fact able to figure out how to solve some of those problems when it was important enough to them to do so. So a lot of the work on algorithmic complexity that is being funded by the tech companies is trying to help them avoid responsibility for oversight. They want to make it look a lot more complicated. It is complicated, but they want to make it look like it's so complicated that they couldn't be expected to control it. But the reality is that they could be held more accountable. Sorry if
No, that's really helpful. That's really helpful. Those were really useful examples. Thank you. That was spot on. So we have a question that I am going to throw out that I think any one of you, any one of the panelists can actually respond to. All of the panelists can respond to. But I also want to draw your attention to Andrea Brennen has been expanding on her comments about trust in the chat. If everyone has not been following that, please, you can scroll back up and see some of her detailed responses there and a lot more information. So our question is from Nathan. This is a CIC student. Is that correct? I'm sorry, I need glasses now. Yes, Nathan Ning asks, what about platforms that seem to be committed to espousing hateful or inflammatory speech in the name of freedom of speech, such as Rob Monster or Epic? So, there are specific platforms about this, and I think, I would throw it to you first, Amy, if you have any comments about that, but anyone on the panel, please.
Yeah, so with the DoD mission, obviously we know of the various platforms where information is disseminated, but we may not necessarily choose to use those platforms to disseminate our own information. One of the things that we can or cannot do, really cannot do, is we are not looking to call anybody out specifically, but what we're looking to do is highlight why those bad websites or the negative content that is received is negative and why it should not be trusted, why it is in the individual who's receiving that content, it's in their best interest to stay away from that content. And we do that through various means. Obviously, with my current position, we use the social media platforms, but there's other ways that we and DoD are able to do that. And then I'll pass it on to David. You look like you might have a comment on that.
Oh no, actually, I'm reading the comments, scrolling through. There were some interesting discussions going on in there.
Okay, well then I'll move on to another question. So Mr. Walsey Carroll asks, is there a website, application, a resource that the average user can use in order to help in fact checking data and sources? And I know that certainly we talk about some different ones in classes that I might mention, but do any of you have ones that you use in your work or that you recommend, again, for the average user? Or we can go pro, I don't know. This is a very advanced audience here.
I know from the DoD side, we don't have something that is readily available to the general population. Usually what we're doing is we're leaning on our intelligence brethren to help us fact check what we are seeing on the internet or in the information environment. Granted, we also know that it may look different through both lenses or for either lens. However, we also recognize that the people that may be receiving the message, because they're receiving it and it's resonating with them, true or not, it becomes their reality, and that's what we have to work with.
Other panelists?
I actually have a question for David.
Oh, well, let me answer the rest of that question, and I might lean on one of my colleagues who's online, so I'm not trying to do this and moderate. But there are two organizations, nonprofit organizations that often present here in collaboration with academia and government. I know the Global Engagement Center has spoken with them, and probably some of our other government partners here. That one is called MisinfoCon, and they also work with something called CredCo, which is short for Credibility Coalition. And on their web pages, they put up a warehouse of tools, some of which are still in development and testing, but they're kind of alphabetical. They work both in the US and they're international. So a lot of them focus on looking specifically at trust and checking things. And they're always trying to come up with different models on how you could verify if information, exactly answering that question, is information trustworthy. And some of them are tools that they tried testing and then didn't get funding for, and so they've been abandoned. Some of them are brand new. They're at all stages, but they basically just try and warehouse it and put it all up there. Thank you, Professor Cherbeck. Exactly, perfect. So just Google those and put them up there, and they have a tools page, and you may find something that is useful. And they try and do something. One of the ones that I thought was interesting from the visualization perspective was how we do nutrition information from the FDA, and trying to say, yes, this is nutritious information, like it's trustworthy, and modeling after that. Okay, yes, go ahead. So please ask your question.
Actually, I just realized that I want to add one little bit to this discussion about fact checking. This isn't something that I can present data to back up, but it's kind of one of my pet topics, which is that I think most of the remember how I said that the information ecosystem, you can think of it as a loop with two funnels pouring into each other, and I think most of the problems are happening on the human side, not the platform side, in terms of like information getting routed up. And one of the things that is conceptually very simple to do, but most people don't because it's kind of unpleasant, might be one way of putting it. There's what I like to think of as how to red team your own brain, which is you basically say to yourself, if I were going to be biased, which direction would I be biased on? You can ask your friends. It's pretty easy to imagine. Do people tend to think I'm like, what kind of person do my friends think I am? And the more you can sort of take a step back from trying to look inside yourself from yourself and imagine that yourself is, a character sheet that you're reading or something like that. Most people, I mean, to put it bluntly, most people know whether they're more liberal or more conservative. Like, it's not really a mystery to most people about where themselves stand. They may not know exactly, but whatever the subject is in question, you probably have a pretty good sense of what would you be insulted to be called. And once you have a sense of which direction you're more likely to lean, then the reality is that the truth is probably more in the other direction than you are comfortable with. The whatever you're thinking, if you back off towards the opposing, whatever you know you're biased in favor of, if you move the slider back until it feels wrong, that's probably closer to the truth. And nobody wants to do that, because that means that you have to accept that you're biased and probably the truth isn't what you want it to be, which is true for everyone, regardless of where you are on any political spectrum or ideological or anything. You know, everyone is biased, everyone equally. You know, smart people, dumb people, Americans, foreigners, everyone is biased. And that means that the truth is going to be kind of uncomfortable no matter who you are and no matter where you stand. And nobody really wants to do that. And I think one of the ways that the social media situation feeds into that problem is that it's so focused on giving people what they want to hear rather than what they don't want to hear. So we have a rich in the unhealthy sense, a richer and richer and richer diet of fattening confirmation bias as time goes on. And people are less and less inclined to think, maybe it isn't what I want it to be. So I think if you're interested in fact checking, you can go a long way by fact checking your own fact checking process, as it were. You can kind of do this internally a bit. And it's an illuminating exercise. So that's all I wanted to say about that.
Okay, challenging your own biases and being uncomfortable. Excellent. Okay, we have several more questions. I think the first one is going to be for Amy from our student Pat B. How well would you say that we're coordinating with the State Department? Specifically the Global Engagement Center.
Sure. We are very engaged with the Global Engagement Center. We do work with them. One of our operations that we did over the course of a period of time was actually sponsored by them. They were the initiator, and they came to us and asked us to support, which we were able to do at that time. We actually, in my current office, we just received a GEC LNO that physically sits with us and helps with our planning efforts, and that allows us to really ensure that our message is coordinated between Department of State and DoD. So it's not always perfect, but I can tell you that we work and do engage so that we can make that relationship and that coordination that much better.
Okay, thank you. And then Professor Cherbuck asks specifically to Dr. Perlman for David, don't we really have a problem with the way that we think about social media platforms? They are not a speaker's corner in Hyde Park, London, but rather more like speaking in a public house where you have the right to where the right to speak is controlled by the proprietor. If we have the wrong model, doesn't that generate faulty expectations?
You know, I want to thank the professor for feeding directly into another one of my sort of pet peeves. Actually, he is correct, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. What you see right now is that there's sort of two party lines, and I apologize. It's very hard to talk about this without mentioning different politically biased positions, because it's just so politicized and polarized right now. It's very hard to have an intelligent conversation by entirely ignoring it. So I apologize for bringing it up at all, but you sort of have one position that says the problem is that these social media platforms are censoring the public street corner, like he says, the what was the phrase? The speaker's corner. So one position says that the platforms are censoring the speaker's corner, and another position says, well, they are private companies and it's more like being at an inn and they have a right to control what's said on their platform. And technically there is merit to both of those positions. But the problem is that you need to take a step back and say, the reason that we're having this argument is because they have so much control. When you have a private company that has so much control over what information gets out to the public, then it actually is kind of censoring the public conversation if that company decides to filter the content. And that's again sort of feeds me back to the broadly speaking antitrust approach. If you had a thriving and diverse ecosystem of a whole bunch of little platforms, and one of the companies decided that you weren't allowed to talk about anything except needlepoint on their platform, that's not censoring the public conversation. That's just saying that there's a needlepoint club where you talk about needlepoint. And then it kind of solves the problem at the source. You know, the source of the problem is that we've all sort of taken it for granted that of course Facebook gets to be so big and so powerful. So I think that the professor is correct, but I think that it's important to keep in mind that this feeds back towards more fundamental structural issues rather than just a question of who gets to say what on what platform when within the current structure of the information ecosystem.
Yeah, David, thanks. Kind of similar to what I was going to ask before. You obviously know a lot more about social media than I do, and you've seen it from the inside. But one thing that I take issue with sometimes in the debate about like the problems with social media is we seem to skip over the reality that these platforms aren't. The effect of these platforms is very negative on our society. I'm not minimizing that, but actually the platforms themselves aren't broken. They're optimized to do something very specific, and they work incredibly well at doing that. So I guess I wanted to get your thoughts on that kind of problems that come from just the scale and the power that these companies have, because sometimes it seems to me that the real problem is that we're putting a lot of expectations onto these platforms that are completely orthogonal to the goals of the company, right? Like Facebook isn't necessarily motivated by a goal to ensure that the most accurate information flows through society. Like that's just, I'm not saying that they're opposed to it, it's just not what they're optimizing around, right? Like most of these companies it's very, very simple. They're just optimizing around ad revenue, which means they're optimizing around eyeballs on content and also like the time that people spend on the platform. So if you look at it that way, I mean, the incentives are just structured in such a way that like the algorithms will do whatever will optimize number of eyeballs and time spent on platform. So yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on how to deal with what seems to me this much more insidious problem of like the bad outcomes that come from these platforms actually working exactly the way that they were supposed to work.
Well, I think you're exactly spot on pointing out that they're working exactly the way they're supposed to work. And, you know, that's sort of goes back to what I said about like sort of phase one or unintentional information disorder, which is just that when you build a social media ecosystem and it's optimizing for eyeballs and clicks, there's a certain kind of emergent behavior that you're going to get from that that's not necessarily socially and culturally meritorious. I'm not really sure what to do about that, because the diversified model that I'm talking about doesn't really change things on that level. The diversified model is more about changing the security model. It's changing the ability for adversaries to weaponize that kind of information environment against Western liberal democracy, or whatever you want to call it. As far as the fundamental problem, that's that you're talking about, which several people in the comments have mentioned about giving people what they want. You know, that goes back to before social media. I mean, Coke and Pepsi, like if you think about it, Facebook makes a lot of money. If you think about what they're doing, and like, you know, if you ask like Plato as he's writing the Republic, how in a healthy society, how big would a social network company be? And that after you got Plato to understand what a social network was, I don't think any sort of philosopher of society would imagine that a toy, like a plaything like Facebook, would end up being such an enormously dominant force in any society. So the fact that it is kind of surprising. But if you back up a little bit, you could also say, if you ask, you know, 500 years worth of nutritionists, or I don't know, that's too far back because there weren't any nutritionists. But you ask people who are knowledgeable about health and nutrition and food and agriculture, what role in the economy of food and agriculture should companies that just sell bottles of sugar water, like how big of a dominant role should those companies have? No one would say that Coke and Pepsi should be as big as they are. I mean, Coke and Pepsi have a lot of money. Those are very wealthy, very successful companies, not as wealthy as Facebook, but still really out of proportion to what they're doing. And the answer is that, it's the same thing. They're stroking like a basic urge. There's a sort of very low level fundamental dopamine reward that comes from drinking caffeinated sugar water. And there's a very low level fundamental dopamine reward that comes from clicking and scrolling on eyeball melting cat videos, which I am guilty of myself. I love me some cat videos. So I don't really know how to reconcile the fundamental question of balancing a society between just giving everybody what they want versus putting somebody in a sort of authoritarian, paternalistic role. I do think that we would have a better chance of finding a healthy solution to that problem if we stepped back from the current situation, where it's also extremely easy for lots of people to weaponize the situation against having a healthy discourse at all, because the healthy discourse, at least, is an important, being able to have a healthy discourse is a prerequisite to being able to solve harder and more complicated problems like the one that you just asked. So I kind of feel like that may have been the biggest dodge that any of us have taken at all so far, but I'm really glad you asked, because it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, or perhaps just worrying about.
Okay, terrific. So those were some really excellent questions. We just have a few more minutes, so I want to combine two final questions and do a speed round. Really, really brief answer, starting with Amy. So I'm going to combine these last two questions, which have some commonality here, to get to them for our final few minutes. And I want to thank all of my panelists for these amazing, detailed stories, anecdotes, experience that you shared with all of us. So from General Michelle Nahas, do you think that people tend to think and believe usually what they think they know, or what they believe in, no matter the source of information and its accuracy? So he's asking just about, does it matter even? They're already going to believe what they believe. And then our Professor Richard Love is interested in thoughts on how noise is juxtaposed with criminal or national security intent, the threat, especially with bots, with regard to bots, coupled with trust. What can modeling and trend analysis do to help game or red team what folks on the other side might be after? And I don't know if you'd heard previously a question on WMDs, but how can we make assumptions and develop escalation ladders and use what we know? This goes to your expertise, Andrea. So are people just going to believe what they're going to believe regardless of accuracy? And how can we help this to inform our national security planning? If there's bots and other things out there, how can we start to help plan around this? I'm throwing it to you, Amy, first.
Okay.
From your experience, are they going to believe what they're going to believe? Can we do something around this? Can we actually plan? Help us out.
Yes,
Give
people
us some
do.
hope.
People do believe what they believe. However, if you understand the culture, if you understand the people, if you understand where they're coming from, then you can find a way to change the message where it still applies to them, where they will still believe it, where it becomes their truth. It's just a matter of how that's presented. As far as the second question, in my role, I would tell you that it's really about ensuring that we inform our senior leaders with all the facts that we have at hand, and ensuring that they understand the implication of those facts that we have, with potentially some assumptions, because we may not know everything, but to give them what we absolutely can give them to make to inform their decision making.
Excellent. Andrea. Short answer.
I think a lot of people have deeply entrenched beliefs, and it's hard for all of us to recognize our own biases, but also this is supposed to be a goal of education. So education is supposed to help us understand other viewpoints and also look more critically at our own beliefs. I forgot the second. What was the second question?
I didn't teach you that answer, but I love it. Thank you.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's hard to do, but it's just something that we all have to make a priority. Oh, one more thought too. I think another challenge of another challenge within the discussion of like evaluating the accuracy or the truth content of social media information that's disseminated on social media. I think sometimes we overlook the reality that a lot of times people share information on social media not just because they believe it's true and they want to spread true information. There's a lot of other motivations for engaging in content and sharing content, and I think a lot of it has to do with kind of reaffirming identity and also broadcasting identity to other people and other groups. And so, yeah, I just think this is such a hard thing because there are so many different conflicting goals, and obviously I think it's very clear to see like a lot of the negative impacts of social media. But yeah, it doesn't, I think in order to address some of these very, very real problems, we have to really kind of try to understand in a deep way, like what's motivating people to act the way they do on social media.
Okay, 15 seconds. You think you can do it, Dave? 15 seconds on the second question. Can we do anything with modeling or trend analysis, red teaming to help us in the national security aspects of this? You're on mute.
So I don't think I can add much in 15 seconds, but the other answers have been pretty comprehensive so far.
All right. Well, again, amazing job. Thank you all so much for your time. I really learned a lot, and I hope everyone else enjoyed this. I was so honored to have all of you join me today. I throw it over to my colleagues for the closing remarks.
Actually, can I just say one last thing, since I totally failed to write a comment in response to Howard Clark, which is that I think that's a very good point. I agree with Howard Clark's response to Patricia Peffley. In particular, not because it's wrong. It's true that people should make better choices. That is true. It is admirable, and the more people think that way, the better. I agree with that. But when you've identified a social problem that is calling for a solution, people just need to do better is not an actionable strategy. It's admirable, it's true, it's correct, it's a point of view that is worth spreading, and I don't want to discourage anyone from spreading that point of view because it is very important to make it deeply culturally normed. However, it is not an actionable strategy towards solving a problem that needs to be addressed collectively. That's all.
Okay, this is why engineers should not be in charge of plants. I'm teasing, as a former engineer. Okay, over to you, Colonel Alexander. Thank you very much.
As an engineer, I will not take offense to any of that myself either.